In the autumn of 1873, a work crew digging a drainage trench beneath the county poor farm struck something that should not have been there. Not a rock, not a root, a wall. Smooth, grey, and warm to the touch, more than 40 feet down, in ground no plough or spade had ever broken. The foreman climbed out white in the face and sent a boy running for the trustees. The trustees came. They looked down into that trench for a long time, and then they did something that makes no sense at all. They did not celebrate. They did not send for a surveyor or a newspaper or a single soul from the outside. They ordered the trench filled back in before nightfall. They paid the crew double their week's wage. And they made every man press his name into a page of a ledger that no one was ever meant to open again. For 150 years that page stayed buried, right along with whatever it was they found down there. Tonight, we dig it back up. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what the trustees pulled out of that cellar and buried again the iron door they bricked over, the survey map that was never filed, the trustees' own meeting minutes with the single line they voted to strike from the record, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's continue. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what a poor farm actually was. Most people today have never heard the term. In the 1800s, nearly every county in the country had one. It was where they sent the people the world had decided to forget. The old with no children left, the sick with no money, the widowed, the orphaned, the ones who simply wandered in from somewhere and could not say where they came from. That last group is the part that historians rush past, because the records are full of them. Men and women admitted to poor farms with no memory of their own names, no papers, no family anyone could trace. They spoke, when they spoke at all, of places that did not appear on any map, and the county clerks wrote them down as feeble-minded, filed the pages, and never asked a second question. The poor farm in our story sat on 300 acres of low, wet ground. It had been built only 9 years earlier, in 1864, and already the cellars flooded every spring. So, in September of 1873, the trustees approved a drainage project. Dig deep, lay stone, carry the water away. Simple work, the kind of work that was never supposed to find anything. The crew went down through the topsoil, then the clay, then a band of grey river gravel that the county's own geologist had marked as bedrock, except it was not bedrock. Below the gravel the digging got easier, not harder. The men said the earth down there was loose, disturbed, as though someone had filled it in before them. And at 41 feet the spade rang against the wall. They cleared a section of it by lamplight. It was not stacked stone, and it was not poured concrete, because poured concrete as we know it barely existed yet. It was a single, seamless surface, curved, as if it belonged to something round and enormous that continued on in every direction into the dark. One of the men laid his bare hand flat against it and pulled back fast. He swore it was warm. Warm, 40 feet underground, in October, in ground cold enough to freeze a water bucket by morning. That is when the foreman stopped the dig and sent for the men who ran the farm. Now here is where the official record and the buried record split apart. The official trustee minutes for that week are almost blank. They note that drainage work was, quote, suspended due to unstable ground, and that the crew was, quote, released with compensation. 2 sentences, nothing more. But the farm did not have 2 sets of books by accident. Poor farms were public institutions. Every dollar was supposed to be accounted for to the county. So why pay a work crew double to walk away from a job half finished? Why compensate men for unstable ground, when unstable ground is the one thing a drainage crew is hired to expect? The answer is that the trustees were not paying for the digging, they were paying for the silence. Before we move on to what they found in the days that followed, stop for a second. What you just heard about that warm, seamless wall 40 feet down is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original trustee ledger. The depth, the temperature, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. For 3 days after the crew was sent home, the trench stayed open. And the trustees did not fill it. They went down into it themselves. We know this from a single surviving source. One of the trustees, a younger man than the others, kept a private diary that his family held onto long after his death. His descendants only allowed portions of it to be read aloud, decades later, and even then they would not release the pages themselves. But what he described is difficult to forget. He wrote that once they had cleared enough of the wall, they found a seam in it, and in the seam a door, not a door cut by the diggers, a door that had always been there, set into the curved grey surface, taller than a man, with no handle, no hinge, and no lock that any of them could name. It was made of a dark metal that had not rusted, though by every account it should have been buried down there for longer than anyone could reckon. Around its edge ran a line of marks. He called them letters, then crossed that out, and wrote instead that they were, in his words, a writing that the eye slid off of. They could not open it. They tried. And according to the diary, the older trustees did not want to try very hard, because the thing about the door was not the door. It was what they could hear on the other side of it. He wrote that when the lamps went quiet and the men stopped speaking, you could hear something behind that metal, a low, steady sound, not a voice, not water. A sound like a great machine turning very slowly, so deep it came up through the soles of your boots more than your ears, and it did not stop. It had, he wrote, the patience of something that had been running for a very long time and expected to run a great deal longer. He tried to copy the marks around the door onto a page of his diary. He wrote that he could hold each symbol in his mind only for as long as he was looking straight at it, and that the moment he glanced down at his paper to draw it, the shape was gone, replaced by the plain certainty that he had understood it a second ago and could not now say how. The page he made is covered edge to edge in careful, deliberate strokes that form no letter in any alphabet anyone has ever been able to match, arranged in rows, as though he were transcribing something that refused to be transcribed. And there was one more detail he set down that night. The wall, the door, the whole curved grey surface was not cold like buried stone. It held an even, faint warmth, the temperature of a living hand, and it never changed, no matter how long a man stood beside it in the freezing trench. Whatever ran behind that door was not the ruin of an old world. It was awake. That was the night, they decided. The trustees held what the young man called a meeting, though no meeting appears in the county record for that date. 7 men, standing in a flooded field at the edge of a trench, arguing in the dark. Some wanted to bring in the university. Some wanted to bring in the state. And one of the older men, the one who had run the farm the longest, told them exactly why they would do none of those things. He reminded them what they were sitting on top of: 300 acres, 140 souls in their care, most of them people no one would ever come looking for. He reminded them that a discovery like this would not belong to them. The moment it was reported, the farm would be seized, the land dug up, the county overrun with men from far away asking questions. And the people in that farmhouse, the forgotten ones, the ones with no names and no memory of where they came from, would be turned out onto the road, or worse, become the subject of exactly the kind of attention no one survives. And then, the diary says, he asked a question that ended the argument. He asked them why the poor farm had been built on this exact spot in the first place, on low, wet, useless ground that flooded every year, ground the county had owned and set aside and quietly kept people living on top of for longer than any of them had been alive. He was suggesting that the farm was not built there by mistake, that the forgotten people had not been placed there by accident. That someone, at some point, had understood exactly what lay 40 feet below and had decided the safest thing to put on top of it was a house full of people the world had already agreed to never think about again. By morning the vote was taken. They would seal it. They brought in a smaller, trusted crew, men from another county who knew none of the history. They bricked over the door where it sat, filled the trench, and laid the drainage stone above it as though the deeper wall had never existed. The survey map showing the true depth of the dig was never filed with the county. The geologist's report was quietly corrected to read solid bedrock at 30 feet, and in the trustee minutes, one line describing what the crew had struck was struck out, voted out, by 7 who agreed to carry the rest to their graves. 6 of them did. The 7th wrote it down. Now, if this were only a story about one strange farm in one forgotten county, it would still be worth an evening. But it is not one farm. That is the part that should keep you up. Because across the 19th century, the same pattern repeats. Asylums, orphanages, poor farms, and almshouses, enormous institutions raised in a single generation on cheap or worthless land, filled with the people least likely to be believed and least likely to be missed. Built with a speed and a scale that the official history struggles to explain, then half emptied, half demolished, and written out of memory within a lifetime. And underneath more than a few of them, the stories are the same. Workers who dug too deep and were paid to stop. Foundations that sat on older foundations no one could account for. Curved walls, sealed doors, sounds in the dark. Reports that were filed and then vanished. Maps that were drawn and then corrected. There is an almshouse 3 states over that tells almost the same tale. A well crew there, hired in 1881 to sink a shaft for fresh water, came up in a single afternoon and refused to go back down. The institution's own logbook records only that the well was, quote, abandoned as unsuitable, and that a new one was dug elsewhere at twice the cost. But a local paper, printed once and then never reprinted, quoted a labourer who said they had broken through into a chamber that was already there, already hollow, already lit by a grey light that came from nowhere he could point to. The paper's editor retracted the story the following week. The original edition is missing from every archive that should hold it. The details change from place to place. The shape does not. Something old and enormous, sitting patiently under the exact ground where the 19th century chose to warehouse its forgotten. And every single time, the same response from the men in charge. Not wonder, not discovery. Cover it. Pay for the silence. Correct the record. And build the house of the nameless right back on top. The people who study what they call the reset believe the timeline we were handed does not fit the world we actually stand on. That there was an older order here, advanced beyond our own, that ended in something none of the textbooks describe. And that the survivors of that ending did not simply die out. They were gathered up, stripped of their memory and their names, and filed away into institutions built directly on top of the very thing that had ended their world, kept close to it, kept quiet, kept forgotten. A house full of people who could not remember where they came from, living directly above a door they were never meant to open, tended by trustees paid to make sure no one ever did. The young trustee lived another 30 years. His diary says he went back only once, near the end of his life, and stood in the field above the sealed trench in the dark. He wrote that he could still feel it. That slow, deep, patient turning, coming up through the ground and into his boots, exactly as it had the first night, still running, still waiting, as though nothing they had done up there in the light had ever reached it at all. He also wrote something the family would not read aloud for the longest time, and only did near the very end. He said that, in his last years, he had come to believe the trustees had gotten it backward. They thought they had buried a secret. He had begun to suspect that the farm, the flooded ground, the whole century of forgotten people passed through that house, had never been a way to hide the door at all. It had been a way to feed it, to keep something living and nameless directly above something that was awake and waiting, generation after generation, for a reason none of them had been meant to understand. He closed the entry by writing that he had stopped going near the field, not because he was afraid of what he might hear, but because he was afraid it might finally answer. The poor farm closed for good in the 1920s. The buildings came down. Today there is a road across part of that land, and fields across the rest, and nothing at all to mark what a work crew struck at 41 feet in the autumn of 1873, or what 7 frightened men agreed to bury on top of it forever. But the ground is still there. The door is still there, and if the young trustee was right, so is the thing behind it, turning slowly in the dark, keeping a kind of patience that outlasts every man who ever knew its name. If this is the first time you have felt the floor of the official story shift under you, then do the thing that stubborn 7 never could. Look down. The document with everything they buried is linked below, the marks around the door, the corrected report, the struck line in the minutes. Read it, and then decide for yourself what was really beneath the old poor farm. And when you are ready to see how deep this actually goes, the next one is already waiting on your screen.